Okay, that hit me a little bit harder than I thought it would, if I'm just gonna be honest. Yeah, there was some feels there. Was not expecting. I mean, I've seen this film before, I like this film, but this is actually only my second viewing. This does not bode well for Pixar We Run on Tears block, which is going to be later this year. This film is generally considered to be good, and sold pretty well. Star Wars, a solo story of solo Star Wars stoliness, is generally considered to be not as good, and did not sell anywhere near as well. Walking into this, I had only one question. Why? Now, I already did a bit of a deep dive into why Solo didn't do particularly well, and I pointed it out very clearly and cutly when it came to the actual results. While the film certainly had its own problems, and I'm not going to reiterate all of them here, looking at the lead-up to and the creation of Rogue One is kind of fascinating in its own right. So, first of all, before I go any further, have you ever heard me say about how network executives and movie executives and studio executives always presume that you're an idiot? Now, we could argue whether they're right or not. That's a different point. But they have consistently said that. Now, this is something I've brought up a lot, especially when it comes to Trek and the other shows that I cover. But in this case, it came up because there was a film coming out that Paramount had pushed out called Rogue Nation. And it hadn't actually been released yet. They were still releasing it. And there was concern that there would be confusion between Mission Impossible Rogue Nation and Rogue One, a Star Wars story. What? Anyways, they thought we were idiots, so there was some kerfuffle there. But as a direct consequence, they didn't market this one that well. Now that's interesting, because this film had one of the, probably one of the most modern marketing campaigns of the Star Wars films in general. What do I mean by that? Social media and word of mouth. I have argued for years that marketing has changed completely, and frankly that most companies haven't really realized that yet. And the ones who do and take advantage of it demonstrably get good results. There's a reason a game like Valheim can suddenly become a booming success simply by virtue of the fact that certain key figures decided to signal boost it, right? So, in this case, I don't know about you all, I walked into Rogue One thinking, yeah, okay. And I came out saying, everyone, you gotta go see this. And everyone I knew did the same thing. And lo and behold, a lot of people went to see it, because it's a good film. Word of mouth. And since this is the age of social media, that word spread very far and very fast. Here's the other thing, though. I'm talking about marketing specifically because I want to really shine a light on this. This film was in production while Force Awakens was in production, because that's how films work, years. And that also meant the marketing department was already marketing Force Awakens alongside Rogue One. Now, how many of you even remember that? No judgment if you don't, because not only did they agree to not do any heavy marketing, thanks to the Paramount thing, but they also decided to try to not compete with Force Awakens all that much. Let me give you a bit of a comparison, because I looked up the figures. They spent over, this is an estimate, $350 million on the marketing campaign of Force Awakens. They marketed the piss out of that. And Force Awakens was a smash success. These, plus one other factor, make perfect sense. It's pretty much the exact same trick that Episode 1 pulled. The reason Episode 1, Phantom Menace, managed to be such a smash success financially was, A, first new main Star Wars film in decades at that point, which is the same thing Force Awakens had going for it, and B, ridiculous marketing push. I've talked about this before. The sheer amount and quantity of Episode 1 marketing is something that's hard to overestimate. It was insane. It was everywhere. Tie-ins and plug-ins and every type of advert you can think of, constantly bombarding everywhere. Same kind of thing happened with Force Awakens. By contrast, Rogue One just kind of slid under the rug a little bit. By the way, estimates again, about $40 million spent on marketing, which is still a decent chunk of change, but nowhere near the same, and frankly kind of low when it comes to major blockbuster films. Now, what's interesting is that's counted into the cost of the film, which was about $270, and it sold for about $1 billion-ish. Now, there's some other figures in there, but that's still a pretty good number. By contrast, Solo cost a little bit more, because of the reshoots and the other issues, and sold a whole lot less than half, close to a third, actually. The thing is, it's hard. I can't give a simple answer. Why did Rogue One sell so well when Solo sold so badly? Well, if this was like a typical advert or a blog post or a website, it would be like 5 reasons you won't believe number 3. But in this case, I can't do that because it's not that simple. The complex answer is that Rogue One zigged in almost every way that Solo zagged. They both accomplished very similar things and tried very similar things. They were both designed to be continuity plugs. They were both designed to be guidance stories to go pursue other aspects of Star Wars. Both of them had very little Force presence at all. Both of them had a completely different tone, and both of them were very much down to ground level rather than the usual high-stakes stuff of the main nonology. And yet, while I like Solo, the quality of both films doesn't really change why they were so financially successful. Now, you know how it is. Sometimes you just can't predict success. Sometimes something is really good and is a smash hit. Jurassic Park. Sometimes something is really good and it's a complete financial bomb. The Princess Bride. So the quality of the film is only one of many, many factors in this. And I do want to make this clear that I'm not comparing the two films in terms of how good they are. That's a totally unrelated argument that, frankly, I have no interest in. These are not reviews, after all. These are ruminations. But financially, I am fascinated at how this one did so much better. And I know what most people are going to say, but I have seen no evidence of the fact that, the controversy surrounding the later sequel films had anything to do with the sales figures of the two films. I talked about that back in Solo. But it is probably worth noting that there's 2 really big differences between Rogue One and Solo. With Rogue One, most of the continuity stuff, the plugging, picture like you've got a puzzle and there's just pieces missing. Rogue One just kind of seamlessly slows in there. There was, I think I counted a total of 2 continuity plugs that bothered me. 2. And both of them were cameos. By contrast, Solo, and this is one of the most often repeated complaints about Solo, was very much in your face and constantly like, hey, here's this, and this, and this, and this. And it is just this barrage of continuity plugs, which I think that different approach kind of bothered people more, which affected the word of mouth campaign, which then affected whether or not the film did as well. But that leads me to the other problem, the behind the scenes. See, Rogue One had a low-tier marketing campaign, and while they did do some reshoots, those were just normal reshoots. There wasn't anything really out of the bounds with that. Solo did massive overhauling of the entire script and structure and this thing, and I talked about that in the Solo Rumination. Point is, lot of work, lot of troubled productions, fired directors, bringing in new people, rehauling this, having to get acting lessons. All the news, all the information that was coming out prior to Solo was negative. And what did I start this whole rumination with? Word of mouth. If you hear about a game that's coming out, or a movie, or a show, and every bit of news you hear is negative, how well do you think that's going to sell? Now, there are exceptions. Sometimes a game that has nothing but troubled news then comes out and sells very well. Cyberpunk. But then, oftentimes, especially when it comes to movies, you have a situation like this. This is, in my opinion, the biggest factor as to why Rogue One succeeded financially, whereas Solo did not. This whole behind-the-scenes, bad news, marketing stint, which just led to a huge loss of faith in the film in general. And I don't blame them. I had the exact same reaction. Now, I liked Solo, for reference, although I like Rogue One much better. I really like this film. It's easily in the top 3 or so of the Star Wars films for me. But, again, not a review. But I mentioned that because the quality of the films, once again, does not have that much to do with how well they are successful financially. Either way, I do want to mention a couple of other things. Actually, do I? Hang on, do I want to talk about that now? Let me check my notes really quick here. I've got so many notes about this film, y'all. Holy crap. Okay, no, let's go ahead and move on then. So, the film has lots of beautiful vistas. Let me go ahead and praise the visuals of this film extensively. It looks lived in. One of the things that I do actually like about all the new Star Wars stuff, all 5 films, is the visuals. And actually the sound design is the other thing, but I'll cover that later. They do a good job of showing large sweeping areas and the lived-in looked feel of several areas and, just that kind of, I don't know what to call it, the Star Wars aesthetic. You know what I'm talking about. It goes all the way back to A New Hope. And the idea of these pseudo-alien things and the fantastical stuff, like we see the trade area, which is a chunk in between 2 asteroids. Just the planet that's completely covered with the roiling storms, the atoll. All of that stuff is fantastic, and I do think that they have put good effort into making those visuals pop. I'm going to talk more about that later, but I wanted to mention that now because it was the first thing that struck me about the film. Then we see Mendelsohn, who is awesome. I've always loved him as an actor. He usually plays villains. Go figure. So he comes out, and he plays Krennic. For those of you not aware, I have a Lorium called the Krennic, and I will be discussing that Lorium throughout this film because, well, there's a reason I call it the Krennic. This film is probably the first most really overt and demonstrable example I've seen of this character archetype, this narrative trope. And it's actually kind of a cool trope, and it's probably the most well-presented here, which is why I call it the Krennic. He lands very far away and walks up with his death trooper slowly. Now you might think, well, that's stupid, and you'd be right. Krennic is not known for his intelligence. He's good at reading people. He is. Especially in the extended canon of AU, there's several works that show that while he's not super smart, he is good at reading people and trying to figure out how to manipulate them. It's pretty much one of his only talents. He is also excessively ambitious and incredibly prideful. So of course he thinks he could just casually land 1 billion miles away and slowly saunter up and just have total control of the situation. After all, he's Director Krennic. Why wouldn't he? At this point, he's actually a part of Imperial intelligence. And that position is part of why he was able to actually find Galen Orso to begin with. And that just says another thing about him, doesn't it? He's put in charge of a particular division of Imperial intelligence, and the first thing he does is tilt all the resources of this division towards finding one man for his pet project, which, as Galen himself admits later, he didn't actually need. Galen wasn't actually necessary for the project. But, Krennic is not that smart, as we've already discussed. So he tilts all these resources to find one man for his pet project, and even his pet project is ultimately just another rung in the ladder in his mind. Krennic is building the Death Star as a career move. I should go ahead, for those of you not aware of the Loriums, there's a website, and it has all the lists, but I'll go ahead and tell you now so you don't have to go check it. A Krennic is a very specific archetype and a very specific narrative trope. It has to be someone who thinks they are big and important and powerful, and they're not. And that's important. They have to be a small fish in a big pond. They have to think they're a big fish in a big pond. And that's the key distinction. Those two little elements have to coincide there. Usually, a Krennic also has a third characteristic, which is they have a big influence on events around them by virtue of their stupidity and their ego. Now, that certainly describes Krennic. After all, he's one of the biggest proponents of getting the Death Star built. Tarkin himself, in the AU, actually said several times how much he didn't like the Death Star project early on because he thought the whole thing was a waste of time and money and effort. Krennic is the one who pushed for it. Anywho, so, Death Troopers, blah, blah, blah. Lyra shows up. She's an idiot. I guess she was upset and hurt, and I get that, and Lord knows that, Krennic had actually tried to use her against him several times, but I'm really not sure what her endgame was there. It is interesting that Krennic tries to talk before he shoots. I only mention that because for all of his foibles, for all of his flaws, Krennic is not as cruel as most Imperial officers are. No, I mean that sincerely. And you might think, well, lore, but no, hear me out. No, what Krennic is detached. Considering he grew up in the engineering division of the Republic, of the Old Republic, and that he was that kind of person, he was raised to be that kind of contractor, architect, builder of designs rather than builder of actual mechanical stuff, there's a logic there that he is so distant to everything that he interacts with that he just kind of he's looking through the glass at everything. So when he sees, for example, the destruction of Jedha and he finds it beautiful, That's because, well, it kind of is, if you ignore the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who just got brutally destroyed. And you see the point. It's distant. This is a good contrast between him and Galen. Galen is extremely personal. He has settled down on a farm. And he has decided to go around and just interact with just his wife and just his daughter. And when it comes to, and there's a tiny hint of this, but when it comes to his life in the next 15 years, we know that he has used one single individual as his motivation to go forward, his daughter. And he obviously cares very much about his engineering staff, despite the fact that they're not traitors and are willingly working on the Death Star project. Thus the contrast. Galen cares about the individual, and Krennic only sees the grand scale. Now, so she dies. You know, I actually did a little bit of looking into this. I was wondering why Saw gave so much of a damn about Galen, because this is Saw Gerrera we're talking about here. He's, if there's one thing that has defined him in all of his appearances, in Clone Wars, in Rebels, in this movie, in Jedi Fallen Order, in the books, the comics, it's the fact that he is ends justify the means. They actually flat out call him an extremist in this very film. So, what the heck does he care about Galen? Well, it's actually a really long and complicated story, which I've decided not to summarize for you because it's a really long and complicated story. All I'm going to say here is that there was a gentleman who I wrote down his name, and I'm like, Has-Obit, I have no idea how to pronounce that, who was part of one of Krennic's schemes to try and influence certain worlds in order to have a show of increased crime so he could justify increased Imperial presence, so they could strip mine them for resources to build the Death Star project, and he ended up kind of coordinating and working around. It's actually one of the ways he rescued Galen back when Galen was being held by the Separatists, because this stuff has been happening for quite a while. The build-up for this has been going on for a while. Remember, they showed the Death Star plans all the way back in Episode 2, which I still think was a mistake. And as a direct consequence of this, Saw kind of ended up working with Obit, and the two ended up being close, and so Saw ended up feeling like he owed the Orsos, and here we are. That's a huge summary. If you want to look more into it, there's materials available for doing so. I want to mention one other thing about the Death Troopers. Other than the obvious tie-in to Dark Troopers, let's just get that out of the way. But I do want to mention one thing. The Death Troopers are the super battle droids. I want to explain that really quick, if you'll forgive me. The battle droids were supposed to be, a faceless army of mooks, so they're acceptable targets, first of all, but they're also dangerous. And the only time that was even close to true was in Episode 1, where they were still intended to be dangerous, but the writers, and by that I mean writer, decided to go and have them be comedic relief a couple of times. Now, if you've never studied Star Wars, allow me to give away the big secret about Star Wars. How Star Wars works is one person does one thing for some reason. Usually for nothing to do with anything. It's just something they threw in. And then future writers who are trying to build off of Star Wars look back and say, well, that person did that. So therefore, we have to build off of that. And that's just Star Wars in a nutshell. I mean, the entirety of Mandalorian culture is a good example of this, but in this case I'm referring to the battle droids, which from Episode 2 and onwards were a joke, a literal joke. They were used entirely for comedic relief. This was especially true in the Clone Wars and continued to be true in Rebels. Both good shows, by the way, I highly recommend them, especially Rebels, since Rebels ties into this movie more than you'd think. Anyways, I'll be referencing it myself during this. So... What do the Death Troopers have to do with anything here? Well, Stormtroopers are a joke. Same problem. The Stormtroopers are a joke and are almost universally portrayed as a joke. So what they did was, okay, we need some battle droids that are actually going to be a threat. Because we've decided to turn these into comic relief, and that's not going to be threatening. So we need something for when the stakes actually need to be high. Hence, they came up with the super battle droids. That's the ones where they've got the gun right on their hand, and they basically don't have a head. Those ones. That's what the Death Troopers are. They're stormtroopers, except actually competent. You'll notice that they further dehumanize them by making it so they never speak. Well, actually, they only speak like 3 times. But for the most part, all you hear from them is just this kind of low robotic tone thing, which makes sense given Death Troopers. And also reminds me of Half-Life for some reason. Anyways, so Cassian shows up. Okay. Turns out Urso convinced Bodi to defect in order to give the big news. Alright, that makes sense. It also says a lot about how much Urso is able to connect on an individual level, and as per Star Wars' overall theme, kind of shows how the individual can matter, even in the grand scheme of things. If you sit back and think about it, we could say, we could point to virtually any character in this bird and say that person was significant for saving the galaxy. And we could. We could do that for like 20 people. 20 people. Each were individual points of things could have gone wrong if that one person didn't do things right. It's just fascinating to think about. Bodi is yet another example of that. And so he gets word from his friend. Now, this is a great way to introduce Cassian. Cassian is like, no, you have to tell us the news. Okay. So he very quickly and efficiently kills 2 stormtroopers. And then he sees that his friend is injured and freaking out. So he shoots his friend in the back. Now, maybe friend is a bit overselling it, but he shoots his contact in the back. Allow me to say something that's going to make me a little unpopular. That was the correct choice. This is how they showcase Cassian Andor. It's a great way to introduce him to the audience. Because that was the correct choice. It was probably the wrong choice, the right versus wrong. But as far as correct versus incorrect, that man was already injured and would have slowed him down in a situation where he was in a hell of a hurry to get out with vital information, and he was freaking out already. Which means if he was caught, he'd probably spill the beans effortlessly, and then the lid's off on that. Shooting him was probably the best overall choice given the circumstances. Now, he does it quickly and efficiently. And I just want you to remember that, okay? Moving forwards. So this leads to Saw, who is rightly paranoid, given all the crap that's happened. And this leads to... I never noticed this last time I saw this. There's this one scene. I might have been doing a bio break at this point. There's a scene where they're going over Jedha, and you can see a collapsed Jedi statue, buried half in the rubble, and you can see the stone that is supposed to be its lightsaber sticking out of it. Just nice little touch there. But anyways, and it'll lead into the wills in a minute. So we're on a Juggernaut. It's always nice to see EU stuff in the AU. They've been cherry-picking a lot, and I have to admit, I've warmed up to the AU a lot more over the years. There's still a couple things I really don't like about the AU. The total lack of technological consistency is one of them. The entirety of Operation Cinder can just go to hell. And other things I'm not allowed to talk about in my own show. But for the most part, I've actually been enjoying how they've been making a deliberate and concentrated effort to tie things together. To explain what I mean by that a little bit, this film directly connects to and references comics, games, books, shows, and other movies. It literally sits at a nexus point of almost all of these. I actually pointed this out before when we were reviewing Jedi Fallen Order, which actually has the exact same status of connecting to so many different things. And that's good. I do like how they're attempting to draw the web together and make things logically follow reason and sense. It is interesting to me, though, that the overwhelming majority of that effort so far, as of the moment where I'm talking about this, because we don't even have any new movies announced as of me recording this. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next year and a half. But so far, almost the ridiculous majority of that effort has been centered in the Galactic Civil War, the Dark Times. The space in between the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. Now that makes sense. There's actually a nice big gap in there, and there's plenty of stuff to fill out, and it's ripe for storytelling. So I'm with it. It's just interesting to note. Anyways, so I love how dirty and worn their armor is. I love K2's introduction too. Almost all the character introductions have been very smart and efficient. K2 is a death droid. That's not his actual terminology. I forget what the terminology of the droids is. Insert 50 people saying it in the comment section. But he is a security droid. Anybody who's played Jedi Fallen Order remembers how irritating these guys are to fight, especially if you haven't figured out their timings and their patterns, especially if there's more than one of them at a time. Fun guys to fight, but very deadly, and that's the point. He is introduced very quickly and efficiently as someone who grabs her and knocks her out in seconds, and literally knocks the wind out of her in a way so that she will no longer be a threat. Thus we see that while he's kind of comedic, because, Tudyk, the fact of the matter is that he is still a very serious and deadly weapon that can be utilized as such. We'll see this later on in the film, too, where he effortlessly and casually destroys many stormtroopers simply by virtue of how good he is at being a security droid. So, They rescued him. Yay! This then leads to Draven and Mon Mothma. Now, Draven is the bad cop and Mothma is the good cop. And this is probably the dynamic they've used several times. For the sake of historicalness, since I've already covered Rebels by this point on the show, and seen Rebels for that matter on this point on the show, one of the things I talked about most extensively over on the Rebels mini-nations was the idea of the snowball, which is an idea I championed and absolutely love. Rebellion was absolutely going to happen in the wake of the Galactic Empire and its increasing oppression, especially since they were so human supremacist, right? So, in a galaxy with so many aliens and so many people who aren't cool with being held on the boot by a dictatorial power, you could understand why there's so much rebellion. But it was all just random people. Like, Syndulla's group was just... Syndulla? Her group was like one ship, with a couple of contacts, with a couple of other people. And that's it. And that was the rebellion. A few individual people who worked in a small group who would try to do things in a small area. And even on the larger side of things, I mean, look at the fleet that is in this very movie. And that is a large fleet by this point in time's standards. And keep in mind, this is after Rebels. Rebels, one of the things I liked most about Rebels, and I'll try not to spoil everything about it, was that it showed the beginnings of the snowball. By showing how the Rebel Alliance was just all these different groups together, but then victory started happening with this one group, and that started gaining traction and attention and recruits and coordination, we see how the rebellion started to snowball into an actual Rebel Alliance. This is a point I made when I streamed talking about this movie many years ago. The Rebel Alliance doesn't exist in this film, as far as I'm concerned. In fact, I would say it doesn't exist until Empire Strikes Back, or just before it, actually. Because what they have is the Rebels and the Rebel Council, who disagrees within itself about everything, and who are all basically all doing their own things. The snowball has started. More people have started rebelling, and there is a council. They are contacting each other, but they're not actually allied yet. They're still just doing their own thing. This film and the next one, A New Hope, both kind of serve as the crucial moments to get that into the point where it's actually going somewhere. Sorry to go off on that, but it's relevant now because you can see the idea here when Mothma and Draven both try to convince Lynn? I think it's Lynn. in order to convince her to help them. Because you get the very strong impression that between the diplomat and the military man, this is the approach they've been using for some time. And as shown in this very movie, it's not a great approach. It's something that only barely works, and even then only because she has a personal interest in the matter. We also notice Organa in the background, since Bale is kind of doing his own thing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So, does Draven make the correct call? I'm just going to ask that question. I'm not going to answer it. Because I'm specifically referring to him ordering Cassian. God, there's so many names to keep track of, and you know me about names. I have a really good memory for everything except for names. It is Cassian. Draven orders Cassian to assassinate Galen. There, I got all three names right there. Do you think that was the correct call at this moment in time? We'll come back to that. So, K2 just steals the movie. What's Alan Tudyk? What do you want from me? You're letting her keep it? Do you want to know the odds that she's going to use it on you? So, then we cut over to Saw. Can I just say really quick, Riz Ahmed, which I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, nails it as Bodi Rook, the pilot. Bodi actually was probably my second favorite character in the film, no joke. Maybe third, because Krennic himself is a fascinating character. He's I don't know, there's something so... He's almost Spitfire is the way I want to take it. You know, he spits fire. He's like, no, I gave it to him, and I rebelled, and I came here. Because remember, his whole motivation is that, and we'd find this out later, is that he wanted to make something better for himself. He wanted to do more. He rebelled, and was convinced to rebel by Galen by sheer virtue of just reaching out to him on an individual level and saying, hey, you matter. Do what you think is right. And so he decided to do this terrible, dangerous, horrible thing, and then they're treating him like this, and he's just, what are you doing? There's no time for this crap. And he's right. But unfortunately for him, he goes to Saw Gerrera. And I don't blame Galen for kind of pushing this guy to Saw Gerrera, but the problem is Gerrera has not been doing well. The last 15 years have not been kind to this poor man. He is physically disabled. He literally needs the oxygen thing, and both his feet are gone. But you can see how deranged he has become over the years. And that makes a perfect sense. Huge praise to the acting of him. Oh, God, I can't think of his... Forrest Whitaker. Forrest Whitaker, who acts as him. I'm pretty sure that's him. Please forgive me if I'm getting the name wrong. He does a really good job of portraying Gerrera at each of his points in history, because he's played Gerrera for quite a few of these specific works. And we see how, we effectively see his story arc as he descends into madness and insanity and paranoia by the end here. By this point in time, he's gone. And everyone still follows him because he's so terrifying and has such a reputation that they still adhere to that. Or they do so because of momentum or sunk cost fallacy. Well, we've gone this far, right? It has to be worth it. But he is in no way capable or competent at this point. And it's so obvious that the great and brilliant person who, granted, was an extremist, is nevertheless gone, and all we have left is a broken shell. I'll come back to that later, too. I really want to praise the lighting in this film really quick, especially for the space scenes. They do some wonderful, beautiful cinematography with the lighting. And I just wanted to comment on that really quick. So, Krennic shows up. Now, this is the second scene we've seen him in. He's indoors, and he's talking to Tarkin. And he's in a cape. Benz Mendelsohn, who, God, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the guy who plays Krennic, really liked the cape, so he insisted on holding on to it. What's funny is that little anecdote might be him just being a good actor and understanding his character. You see, everything points to his Krennic status here. There's a reason I call this a Krennic. He is talking to Grand Moff Tarkin. Now, Grand Moff Tarkin is, at this point in time, probably the third most powerful, dangerous, and terrifying person in the Galactic Empire, second only to Vader and Palpatine himself. And I mean that with sincerity. Tarkin was a shark. He was a big fish in the big pond. Tarkin is wearing a normal, olive, kind of drab Imperial uniform. No fancy things, no hat, no medals clattering everywhere. He doesn't need it. He's Tarkin. He is who he is. He doesn't need to look impressive. He simply is impressive. And he talks so eloquently and smoothly around everything that Krennic says. By contrast, Krennic wears a bright white uniform, which is unusual for Imperial make. In fact, it invokes the idea he's a Grand Admiral. Many people thought he was a Grand Admiral in the initial trailer, because white uniform. And he wears a freaking cape. And he constantly tries to portray himself as better. He postures. Seeing the two side by side really makes this point clear. And it really helps showcase just how pathetic Krennic is under him. Bit of backstory, because that's my job. This is, again, very complex. Krennic has known Urso since school, and the two of them basically graduated together. A bunch of stuff happened, but the long and the short of it is Krennic arranged to rescue Galen from the Separatists, and then spent years manipulating the situation around him to convince him to, basically to try and prevent him from getting a job, so he would eventually join him and join Operation Celestial Power, which was a project, an engineering project designed to try and harness the power of Kyber crystals as direct energy. I'm not going to go into that because that's a whole other thing. But this is something the AU changed. First of all, Kyber crystals exist. I know there were lightsaber crystals before, but they're a totally different thing. Second of all, Kyber crystals are great energy focusers, and third of all, they are capable of producing terrifying levels of power, far above and beyond anything else. This is why the Death Star has something that can destroy a planet, is because it's got the Kyber crystal core. I'm sure every single one of those Star Destroyers in Episode 9... No, we're done. No. Sorry. Couldn't resist from the snark. Sorry. The Star Destroyers are so stupid. Moving on. So, there's another thing to mention, though. Krennic was under the direct authority of Tarkin for years, possibly into the decades range. Huge chunk of time. And he hated it. Krennic was always someone who had a massive ego and tons of ambition. Not a great combo. And he chafed at being under Tarkin, and he grew to hate Tarkin and to view Tarkin as his personal rival. For reference, Tarkin did not view Krennic as a personal rival. Tarkin viewed Krennic as yet another middle manager. Because he was. Moving on. So, we see the ruins of Jedha and the Wills, and there's an Imperial Star Destroyer just hanging out immediately over the city. I will admit the ship geek in me saw that and was like, how is an ISD an Atmo? But I'm not going to get into that. Then they do a long shot of the city. And you remember the special edition when they did the long shot of Mos Eisley when they're on approach? That was pretty cool, right? This long shot is better in almost every way, just in the presentation and the execution and the showcasing of a city. It's very, very, very well done. Gets across the scale and scope of the city. But they do this very beautifully, because first thing they show is the Star Destroyer hovering over this thing. And the Star Destroyer is just a little bit bigger than the city, right? We see that from a distance. Then we zoom in as they're going into the city. We need a nice, long, establishing shot, the second unit shot of the city. And then we zoom down to the people in the city, and then we look up and we see the Star Destroyer. That framing really helps showcase everything that needs to be shown here. It gets across the scale of the destroyer. It gets across the scale of the city. And it showcases the city literally being under the shadow of the Empire, as well as the oppressive nature of what it would be like to have that thing hovering over you all the time, because that would be absolutely terrifying. So, then we have the Boar Gullet. You know what's funny is this scene probably could have been ejected from the film. I hate to say that, but it doesn't really have any lasting effect on Bodi, and Saw Gerrera doesn't really do anything with the information that he supposedly gets, which is never referenced, by the way, from the Boar Gullet. And it's just there because as a way to further show how Saw has completely lost his mind. That's it. Moving on. This then leads to Chirrut and the Force sensitivity. So it has been confirmed in ancillary works that he is actually Force sensitive, just not to the extent that a full Jedi would be. The midi-chlorians, they're a little allergic, I do want to mention, I like the quick showcasing of him. There's this really great bit where he's walking out to the stormtroopers, and he turns to the side, and we focus on his ear, and then we show less than a second of a stormtrooper's foot bracing against the sand for the shot, and then he takes them all out. Now, it's a cool scene, and it's some good camera work, but it's also interesting because it kind of emphasizes a point that I've personally always believed. While he is Force sensitive, he is only Force sensitive. I think that the main reason that he is as good of a monk as he is because he also has worked on his other senses and has actually trained and honed himself. Or, to put this bluntly, he would make a really good Jedi. Let me explain that really quick. One of the things that I tend to like in fiction, Harry Potter and Star Wars both go into this exact same concept, is the idea that people tend to lean on power, direct power, like magic or the Force, a little bit too heavily, so it becomes a crutch. And then there's people who work very carefully and precisely and push themselves to be as skilled as they can with their power. And those people are usually arguably more powerful, even though they have less raw strength than others. And that's always a concept I've enjoyed. And that's what I'm bringing up here with Chirrut. I like the idea that because of his precision and skill and his work and training, he is technically capable to the level of being a Jedi, even though he is weaker than an actual Jedi. Anywho, so then a lot of people die. A lot of people get shot in this film. There's this great moment where Jyn rushes out and saves a kid. That's cool. I should probably mention that kid canonically dies. That's actually been confirmed. So just wanted to mention that really quick. It's very important that you know that child died because, oh my God, this film. So Cassian shoots Saw's person. Sure. And this then leads to probably the funniest moment in the whole film. Now, of course, it has to do with K2. But she grabs a weapon and she starts badassing her way through the stormtroopers. And then she turns and sees a security droid and shoots it and it falls over. And right behind it is K2, who's like, Did you know that wasn't me? That got me. I'll give you that. I probably should have taken more hits than that too, but let's ignore that for right now. There's also a bit where, Cassian has been, yes, I will take them prisoner. I will imprison them to prison. And Cassian's like, yes, we're going, shut up. And he smacks him. So Tudyk had a thing. He's a snarker. He's the real life person, not just when he's acting. He has a really great talent for just coming up with material on the fly. If you've ever seen him off camera, so to speak, obviously he's on camera, but if you've ever seen him out of character, he does that constantly, and he's really dry about it. Apparently that smack was completely ad-libbed, and if you're paying attention, you can see Cassian immediately covers his face, most notably his mouth, to cover the fact that he was desperately trying not to laugh at the smack. There's actually a few scenes that still made it into the final cut where the camera shakes just a little bit because the cameraman was laughing at something Tudyk had just said, and just was because it was just well. And there's a few moments like that throughout the film. Anyways, love Baze's heavy repeater. I don't even have anything else to say about that. It looks good. It sounds good. Ooh, great weapon. Moving on. So, this film takes the lesson of Empire Strikes Back, as I just kind of gave across there. Well, this is a very dark film. In fact, several people have considered this to be the darkest of the Star Wars films overall, and I would say it's at the very least in the running. It bothers and goes out of its way to have moments of levity in order to try and alleviate that. And I call that the Empire Strikes Back lesson. Obviously, this goes before that. But I'm sure they were taking direct inference from that, especially since so many other films have done the exact same thing from the exact same film. Avengers Infinity War is a perfect another example of this, where a very dark film nevertheless has moments of levity and jokes and tone that kind of help to make the whole thing a little more swallowable. This is also when they start mentioning the word hope. Now, I've heard a few people make fun of the fact that this film overuses the word hope. So I counted. They use the word hope 6 times in the whole film. This is a 2-hour film. So allow me to professionally disagree with that assessment. I do think they overuse it in one scene, but we'll get there. So, I mentioned how terrifying the ISD is, since it was in orbit. You know what's more terrifying than having an ISD just parked over you? An ISD leaving without word or warning. Just pulling out. And, I mean, it's actually, as Rebels established, there's a lot of connections to Rebels, I already mentioned this. As Rebels established, it is typical Imperial policy to withdraw all Imperial forces before commencing bombardment. Rebels also directly references Base Delta Zero, by the way. This isn't Base Delta Zero, this is actually less than Base Delta Zero, I'm just pointing it out. So yeah, it leaves. All its support craft are leaving too. That's terrifying. I want to talk about the camera work very briefly. There's some excellent camera work in this film. You remember the very beginning of A New Hope? Of course you do. Everyone knows that scene, even if they've never actually seen the movie. It's, the Tan of Four is like, and then you see the Devastator going right overhead. Or the Hammer, I never remember which ship, but it's one of them. Goes right overhead. It's, and then it just keeps going. It's like, oh my god. And as I've gushed about many times, and as has anyone else who's ever studied film ever, that was a fantastic establishing shot and perfectly sets up the film, just right there in without a single line of dialogue. Beautiful work, right? Why am I bringing that specific scene up? Because they pull the same trick here, just more quietly. So we see the Star Destroyer start to leave, and we see it from the city, so you can only see like the outer edge, just like one tiny chunk of this destroyer as it's leaving. Then the camera zooms out a bit, and we see other people who are, and we see like the camera is now miles away from the city, and we see the support craft leaving with the destroyer. And then the camera zooms out even more, and we see the crew who's looking over and is like, why is the destroyer leaving? And then the camera zooms out even more, and you can still see the Star Destroyer. The city itself is invisible except for the mesa. You can't really distinguish the buildings, but you can still see the ship hovering over it as it's leaving. And you can see how they pull off the same trick of emphasizing the size and terror of this device by this usage of the camera. Brilliant stuff. So, they make it to Saw Gerrera's place. I wonder how many of them recognize her from her old days. It's been a few years, after all. I noticed so many aliens amongst Saw's group. That makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, aliens amongst the rebels in general makes sense. As I already said, human supremacy is going to engender non-human rebellion. Duh. But at the same time, seeing this here kind of makes me think that aliens, more alien aliens, let's put it that way. People who look less human would probably be more subject to the kind of bigotry that the Galactic Empire pushed, both in the EU, under the Tarkin Doctrine, or in the AU, because they're evil, and therefore would be more willing to be more extremist, to join a group like Saw Gerrera's. Just food for thought. So, then Saw and her interact. It's actually a really good scene. Very good character piece. It's also her first character moment. This is weird, and I commented on this in the stream discussion. Many other people have commented on this before. Well, this is an excellent film in many ways, and a good character piece, and a good setting piece, and has some great continuity. Tightly scripted plot, and excellent visuals and visual presentation. The fact is, the character of Jyn is not great. And it's hard to explain why, because it's not like she's a bad character or a bad actress, because neither is true. It's more like her arc is unusual. We get introduced to her right at the beginning as a child, and then she's a prisoner, and then we cut away to Cassian, then we cut away some other stuff, and then we see her being rescued, and then she's convinced, and then she's mostly a passenger. Most of the events and actions that happen don't really involve her in the strictest sense of the word, other than the fact that she is present. Right up until this moment. Now, this moment, which is quite a ways into the film, is the first time she is actually relevant and front and center when it comes to the characterization. It's also our first moment of characterization for her. Effectively, this is her character intro. Remember how I talked about how K2 has a great intro, and Cassian has a great intro, and Chirrut has a great intro. All the main characters, Bodi too, all of them have a great establishing scene. This is hers, except it's way over here. I think that's why so many of us have trouble with her as a character. It's worth noting that the ancillary works do flesh her out a little bit more, as usual. But one of the things I myself have said about this film is it either need to be longer, to flesh her out more, or shorter, to chop out the unnecessary parts of her arc. Because what we effectively see, I keep using that word, but it's true, we effectively see half of a character arc with her. We catch up with her in mid-stride. Whereas Cassian, we see most of what is actually his second character arc throughout the course of this film, which I'll talk about later. And most of the other characters, we see, a full arc. But hers, we start up here and then we finish over the course of the film. But I digress. She interacts with Saw, and it's a great scene. It is a legitimately good character scene. It's one of the reasons I say she's a good character. And we see Whitaker really nails the completely mad Saw at this point. He really does. He is, I say mad, broken might actually be a better word. This man is so far gone. When he thinks that she might have been the one sent to kill him, you know what his reaction is? Huh. That's a shame. Like, he doesn't say it that way, but that's what's on his face. That's what's in his tone. Like, there's just this sort of sadness and regret about that. Like, okay. But when it's revealed that no, and she's still upset at him for, in her own words, abandoning him, he points out that he was protecting her. I want you to remember that for 1 second. Saw Gerrera, the extremist, whose big shtick is the ends justify the means, did not want to go over a line. Even he has lines, and in this case, his line was he did not want to use her as a hostage against the Empire. And so he kicked her out of the group, effectively, gave her a weapon, gave her a bunker, and said, I'm out, peace. So that she would be safe. Interesting. It also shows how much he cared. Given the fact that he took her in when she was quite young, it's entirely feasible that he really did think of her as his daughter. Obviously not biological, but in every way that mattered, right? So that lines up. Saw is not an evil person, after all. He does many evil things. He is an extremist. He has done many horrible acts, and he does become a broken man by the end. But to call him malicious, or malevolent, or cruel? No. Anyways, so she is unflinchingly honest as she responds to him, and she says a quote that I want to share with you word for word. He says, "Are you okay with the Imperial flag hanging over the empire, or over the galaxy?" And her response, oh my god, her response is, "It's not a problem if you don't look up." Ouch. That says so much about the half of the character arc we haven't seen, and it says so much about the state of the galaxy as a whole. It is arguably the main theme of the entire work. And Rebels, the show that leads up to this. So many people just want to keep their head down. They don't want trouble. They don't want the disruption in their daily lives. They're not happy with it. They don't like the Empire. They're not fond of the way things are run. But it's not my problem, and I'm just going to leave it alone, and hopefully it'll leave me alone. If you're paying attention, that is the exact same attitude Luke had in A New Hope, too, which, again, also showcased how the galaxy as a whole perceived this whole situation. So, beautiful lighting. The Death Star. What follows is my favorite sequence in the entire film, to be honest with you. Because they're in the Death Star and they decide to do a single reactor ignition. Now, we know exactly what the Death Star can do full power. But at the same time, this scene does a better job of emphasizing what the Death Star is than A New Hope did in its entire runtime, my opinion. Now, I want to talk about that, but give me just a second. What we see is Bodi kind of recovering as he's struggling for identity. And there's just this quietness and this almost imperceptible music playing in the background as she is seeing this message from her father, this huge emotional message as he's revealing all that he's been keeping bottled up for years and how much he's cared about her. And she hasn't seen hair nor hide of her father for 15 years. She said that earlier. This is a huge emotional moment, and credit to the actress, Felicity Jones, I think, but whatever. She nails this point, because this is 15 years of emotion that's been bottled up that is just smashing right into her face. Like a mallet. When she falls to her knees afterward, like actually falls, like legitimately, it probably hurt the actress to do that. You can feel the impact of that, of how much this is just destroying her emotionally. And how she can barely comprehend it, how she can barely keep up with it. It's like, oh my God. Because her father did love her. He wasn't a traitor, and he's been working this whole time for her. I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. Because there's so much to unpack in this scene. Let's talk about the juxtaposition. As this is happening, as this big, emotional, investing character moment is happening, you cut to the Death Star, and they're hitting the buttons and doing the thing and firing up the reactor, and give it a few seconds, and then poof, and then they get the shot off. And the shot's impressive. Come back to that one too. I got so many things to cover in this scene. We find out about the Death Star flaw. Now, I've heard many people talk about the flaw of the Death Star. Let me go ahead and say that I think this was a good addition. That being said, I also fully understand why people hate this addition. Let me try and give both sides of this, but as always, I am curious of your thoughts. First of all, the whole point, thematically, back in A New Hope, was that it was the impossible shot. They made the shot with the computer, remember? It failed. The whole point was that it was this magic 1 in a billion, no way it's ever going to happen shot. And Luke got in there and used the Force and managed it, and that's what got them the win. It shouldn't have worked. It was never a guarantee. Even then, they were seconds away from failure, and would have failed if not for that one guy who just kept saying stand by. So, that is kind of ruined by adding the flaw, adding the thing. But I don't agree with that personally. Because it's still the impossible shot. They still had so little time and so little to work with, and they were so under the gun that this is the method by which they decided to use to exploit the weakness. Remember, he says it in this film very clearly. The weakness is not the exhaust port. The weakness is in the reactor. That if you hit it in a certain way, that it will cause a chain reaction, and that's the end of the whole thing. And that's the actual weakness. It's getting to that's the tricky part. Under other circumstances, they might have been able to try and land a person on the Death Star and actually go infiltrate it and do it from within. Or maybe have a full fleet, if they had such a thing, try to actually hit just the right point, or whatever. There's other methods here. The reason they sent the snub fighters in order to try and do their desperate mission was because that's all they had, and they were screwed, right? So to me, this doesn't detract from A New Hope. And I do like the idea that he had to design this in such a way so that most people wouldn't notice it. Like if there's a giant blinking port that says, "Here, shoot me," that probably wouldn't have worked. And that's why I again emphasize that it was the core that was the flaw, not the exhaust port. All right, so that's that thing. There's so much juxtaposition between the personal and impersonal in these scenes. I said I'd talk about the Death Star fires up. It literally casts a shadow all over the face of the planet. And visuals. The power of visuals. I want to sit and talk about this for a moment because this is something that I have found to be true many times, and it's hard to understate how important this is, or hard to overstate, how important this is. Good visual and audio design, told you I'd come back to this, good visual design especially, can sell something in a way that nothing else can, probably because we are such visual creatures. You could be reading a book, and that book could describe the mantle being crushed and the destruction, the mantle sheathing away as the cascading shockwave just pushes Earth on the hundreds and thousands of tons range out of the way as this ridiculously devastating blast is completely scarring this moon and probably rendering it uninhabitable forever, or at least for the millennia range after this. And words can describe that. I could describe that to you as a GM, or as a writer, or as a narrator, or whatever. But none of that will feel quite the same as seeing it. This is one of the reasons why so many people tend to visualize things when they read books and novels. And there is the argument, a valid one, that the mind will come up with a more impressive thing than the creative work can, right? You picture it and therefore it's more personal to you, that old concept. But I have learned over the years that if you have the talent, and I put that at the top of the list for a reason, the talent, the time, the tools, the money, and the personnel in order to actually really showcase something, really showcase it, there's a power to that that's hard to overestimate. If you have not seen this film, I highly recommend you find a shot somewhere of just the destruction of Jedha. It's spelled Gedha. If you have this film available, or watch this just before this, please either pull up that scene again or remember it and just watch it. You can even have it on silent. Watch how they visually showcase the scale and scope of this devastation. And they do it from multiple angles, and they do it for several minutes. And it is monstrously, horrifically terrifying. And the impact of that, again, it's so powerful because they were able to do it. This is, like it or not, the advantage of the big budget films right here. Being able to show this moment. Oh, sure, there's the fancy battles and the big CGI fests and all that other stuff, which is good, but we've been able to do that for years. But Episode 1 couldn't have done this scene. And they actually had decent CGI. Well, they actually had access to CGI and that kind of special effects back then. They couldn't have done this kind of shot. Not really. All you have to do to see the comparison is look at the destruction of Jedha versus the destruction of Alderaan and compare the two side by side. And while the destruction of Alderaan is worse, the destruction of Jedha looks worse and is so much more impactful in how it's utilized, both in the narrative and in the film in general. Anyways, I wanted to talk about that for a while because, God, there's a value. I thought about this. There's a value in having a new cast when it comes to an established franchise like this, because you can kill them off however you want to. What I mean by that is when I was first watching this film, I remember at several specific points in the film thinking, they might actually die here. Huh. Because, if you say Luke Skywalker in a film, he's not going to die. He's fine. It's Luke. He's cool. Whatever. Right? And so I remember at several points thinking oh my gosh, they might actually not make it out of this one. By the way, Saw is the first one to die. He clearly accepts death. He, in fact, embraces death with his eyes open, if you catch that. Why do you think he did that? Was it because he was tired? Was it because he was broken? Was it because he was in almost every way already dead, and there was just enough left of him to recognize that? Allow me to give one tiny little theory that came to me during this particular analysis. Jyn is a spark. She is someone who certainly has felt lost, but she hasn't been ground down. There's none of that, defeatism in her, right? There's none of that, there's no point in it. Well, she had been that way, because I just realized I haven't talked about that yet. Sorry. I skipped over a beat. There was so much to unpack in that scene. I'll get to that in just a second. While she certainly has kept the shell up for 15 years or 10 years or 5 years or however long it actually is, she isn't actually broken. She isn't actually grounded. She's not... There's a degree of acceptance to it, which I don't know how to explain. I know this feeling because I've been there myself. I'm not there now. Don't worry. But there's an acceptance of bad. Unfortunately, I imagine several of you know what I mean by that, where it's just, it's normal. It's what? And you don't really care for it, but you don't even really think about it all that much because it's what it is. It is how life is. There is that feeling and vibe and tar coating virtually every character in this film. And if you pay attention, the course of this film is a spark igniting that tar and reigniting the flames of the people who have been buried in it. Bodi being inspired by Galen is just the first peak of that. Jyn, I think, inspired that flame within Saw. And you might think, well, then he would fight, but no, he recognizes that he's too far gone and he's done. He's done and he's gone. But knowing that there's hope, he can let go. He can finally let go. Because someone else has carried the mantle that he, in his mind, has been carrying for so long by himself. And we see this further on. Jyn ends up inspiring so many people to do things that they never would have. I mean, the Cassian scene in just a few scenes from now is a perfect example of this. But you're probably thinking, Laura, you skipped over a step. And you're right. Let me rewind here. Jyn was seemingly just as broken as everyone else, but she actually wasn't. I know what that feels like, too. I really hope none of you know what that feels like, because it's usually a reaction to trauma. When you just kind of stop processing, is how I like to think of it. Of course, I'm a very computerized person, but whatever. It's okay, I swear I'm human. I shouldn't say that. I'm probably human as far as you know. But you just kind of imagine there's a vat. And within this vat is all the stuff that you're dealing with. And there's a connected smithy or something, like a refinery right next to it. And it pulls all the stuff that's been dumped into the vat and it processes it. And it codes it, and it analyzes it, and you move through it. Good and bad, by the way. You know, you feel the good, you feel the bad, you express the pain, you cope with issues, you exult in your victories. All of that stuff is all the processing. But that processing is a separate function from just the intake. But when you're going through really horrible stuff, when the trauma has hit you so hard, or some other reason. There's other reasons you could do this. Like, for example, maybe you simply don't have a reason to keep going, or maybe you've lost the only home you've ever known, or maybe you're trying to keep yourself on the down low so you don't give yourself away because you're a super spy. And yes, Galen goes through the same thing here. That's kind of the point I'm leading to. But my point is, everything just piles up in the vat, and nothing is processed. So it just sits there. This is why I say she's not actually ground down, because she's not. She just hasn't been processing things for years. It's just been sitting there, building up. And in the brilliance of the scene, wonderful credit to Mikkelsen, by the way. In the brilliance of this scene, when she was looking at the hologram of her father, we see that both her and her father were in the same state. He had stopped processing so he could learn to lie, as he himself said, so he could do what he needed to do to save her. She stopped processing because she lost her parents, and then lost the only parent she ever knew, which was Saw. In that scene, both of them start to process. This is why she collapses on the floor, literally landing. I hate to give this away. I've done that. I have actually fallen to my knees before, once. Just once. I had the scar on my knee for months afterwards because I weigh 200 pounds. And so when 200 pounds just kind of collides with the concrete hard, believe it or not, it tends to leave a bit of a mark. But in that moment, I had started to process. And that's exactly what happens to her. It's just, and like I described earlier, it hits her. And from this moment on, she's herself again, and she's starting to chew through all the things that she's been dealing with this whole time, and she gets angry, and she gets we need to do something about this, because Cassian correctly later points out that she has decided not to care about the rebellion until now. And he's right. But the reason he's right is because she hadn't been caring about anything until now. But now that she started processing things again, we all deal with things in different ways, after all. We saw how he dealt with things, and I'll get back to that in a minute. So brilliant scene. Again, best scene of the whole film right there. I've probably been talking for 10 minutes about a scene that's only like 5 minutes long. Absolute. Could not gush enough about it. So then it gets even better, because this is actually the exact scene where I came up with the term Krennic, where I decided to start using it as a lorium. Krennic is all gloating. Yes, beautiful thing. Everything's great now. And Tarkin takes over the Death Star from him. Like that. Effortlessly and casually. Once again, the contrast between the two is brilliant, because Tarkin is calm, controlled, and eloquent with the way he utilizes his words. And, once again, he's just dressed like any other Imperial, because he doesn't need to flaunt. The one person in the room who stands out is Krennic, with his frickin' cape and his white outfit. And he postures and rages, and he loses his control, and he actually rants about the situation. Krennic. Tarkin. Brilliant contrast. And, of course, Tarkin has now effortlessly decided has been using Krennic for years, actually, according to the ancillary works, in order to boost his own power and take command of the Death Star project. So, good job, Krennic. You just handed the most terrifying weapon in the universe to date to one of the most terrifying people in the universe ever. Yay. So, this then leads to them calling back in. All right, base, what do we do? And Draven says, make sure you kill Galen no matter what. All right, I said I'd bring it back up, and here we are. At this moment, Draven's decision actually makes no sense. The weapon exists. It's already been fired. Jedha is gone. Kill Galen no matter the cost. Why? Now, okay, there are reasons to do that, but at this point, even if you ignore all concern of ethics and morality, even if you're only concerned with the correct or the incorrect, at this point, it is far more correct to try and extract him, at almost any cost, to learn anything you can about this Death Star. This is regardless of the fact that Galen is in fact a sympathizer and would willingly collaborate with the Alliance. No, even if he was a staunch Imperial, this would still be worth doing, for the chance of getting the intel and information they need to do anything about the Death Star. But no, assassinate. Whatever. What's that word? Oh, yeah. You notice this is a D&D party, by the way? Let's see. We got the spy, the pilot, the scoundrel, the heavy, the monk, and the tank. Yeah, no, that's a pretty good party. It's funny how many films follow the D&D model, if you really think about it. It's also possible D&D follows the film model, but that's getting into semantics, I think, at that point. And either way, Chirrut senses things are off. K2 notices he has his gun and the sniper thing. Does he have the face of a killer? No, he has the face of a friend. Ouch. But that also makes sense, because Cassian is a Cisco, not a Justice Lord. For all of the crap he's had to do in his career, there is no desire within him to do these things. As he says, he's been part of the Alliance and part of the Rebellion since he was 6. This is just the life he knows. This is how he copes. This is when we really get an insight into his character. He does not want to be like this. This is also interesting, though. He gets Galen in his sights. He doesn't pull the trigger. He could several times, but he chooses not to. However, he keeps the gun trained on him. Why is that relevant? Well, because it's clear he hasn't decided yet. Then what happens? Krennic tries to kill the engineering squad, and Galen rushes out and says, no, it was me. Because Galen, again, cares about the individual. And thus, Cassian sees that. Cassian doesn't have context, but he doesn't need it. He visually sees the stalwart Imperial commander, and Galen rushing forward saying, no, please. Just his body language shows everything that he needs to see. Galen inspires Cassian, and that spark is lit. And this is probably the exact moment Cassian is ignited, and to continue the analogy I used earlier. This is also when he puts his gun away, because he has now decided. And then he just pulls out his binoculars to continue to observe the situation. Huh. So, Chirrut has luck manipulation, apparently. He shoots a tie and it hits a turret. Come on. So, Mads Mikkelsen is an amazing actor. Great in everything I've ever seen him in. He doesn't say these words, but the actor gets across a tone beautifully. If I was his director, I would be praising the crap out of him. As he's laying there dying, and he sees his daughter for the first time in 15 years. It was worth it. All that shell, all that lack of processing, all that living under the yoke, all the careful, painstaking effort to build this weakness and this flaw, to get the information out, it was all worth it. And he gets all of that across in his expression, in his tone. God, imagine waiting 15 years for one moment. Naturally, she's nearly catatonic and has to be physically separated from him and dragged away before she starts walking. Cassian and Jyn have a bit of a row here, understandably. And what's funny is both are right in their own ways. She's still in shock. He's right about that. And her point about him and, his being no better than stormtroopers is completely wrong, because he is completely different from stormtroopers. But at the same time, he is wrong about her and the idea that she is simply trying to place blame. And he is also very right about her, that she has only recently decided to actually start caring about a rebellion he has been involved in for much longer. And we can see both sides there. And, well, that doesn't go anywhere, unfortunately. But this scene and the previous scene really work with Cassian for me. Both of their points are great, but Cassian's pain is so on display. And this, by the way, is one of two reasons why I am actually excited about the Cassian series, which obviously hasn't come out at the time of recording. It doesn't even have a release date as of the time of the recording here. But I'm actually looking forward to the Cassian series. Why? The actor and the character. I would love to know what he has been through in the years during the Great Dark. So, Vader. We finally see Vader. They deliberately pushed him back. He's over an hour into the film because they don't want to overuse him, and that's a good move. This is a film about low-tier stuff. It's okay to have high-tier stuff in a film about low-tier stuff because that helps to emphasize the contrast, like they did with the Star Destroyer earlier, like they've already done with Tarkin. But Vader, that's a shark. That is a big fish. What's interesting is Vader's just hanging out in his tank. Thoughts. First thought. That's probably the closest thing to any kind of relaxation or comfort he has in his life. Second thought. Obviously, his totally not Bast castle is on Mustafar, which is extremely Sith. This is my moment of greatest weakness, and I have created this monument on top of it to show that I rose above my own weakness, and I am now strong. Or there's other interpretations too. Why do you think he set it up on Mustafar? Third thought. He's not doing anything. He only gets out because he's been called. Now, if we pay attention to the reading between the lines, and the Darth Vader comics really flesh this out, Vader was in a complete malaise at this point in time. Probably has been for years. He goes out, does what he is ordered to do, and then he does it very well because he's frickin' Darth Vader. And then he goes back, and then he hangs out in his Bacta tank, and he just sits there. He doesn't care about anything. He doesn't want anything. He doesn't do anything. Now, all of that is important because the AU's Vader is different from the EU's Vader. The EU's Vader was a driven and skilled person who constantly strived to challenge himself against all that he sought and was then disappointed when no one could keep up with him. By contrast, the AU's Vader has already given up. He has no reason or purpose, and then is just kind of lounging around. Until A New Hope. After A New Hope, he encounters Luke, and that ignites a fire in him. And if you pay attention, and again, the Vader comics really show this, but if you pay attention, after A New Hope, and again, leading into Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, all of a sudden he's moving again, he's active again, he's ambitious again, he's driving and going and doing. He has an entire massive fleet and an SSD under his personal command, which he is driving out there to find the Falcon and his son, and he's going to overthrow the Emperor, and he's going to take this galaxy, and he's going to make it right, because now, well, he's on fire. Anyways, so Vader, right? How many people do you know who, when they were called to task for peeing on the rug and are being, scolded for it, would try to use that moment, that meeting, to be like, so I get the new corner office, right? Like, can I get a window office this time? And he tries to push this into a power play. Oh, I love you, Krennic. You are so stupid. This is a good time as any to mention the sound design. All right. I've talked before about visual design, and I gave the example, and I gushed about it forever, and I will continue to gush about it in the future. But the sound design... Now, Star Wars has always had great sound design. Some very, very talented people, I don't remember their names right now, have been responsible for the unique and fantastic sound of Star Wars going all the way back to A New Hope. But there's been something better about the sound design of the new movies, and I don't have a better way to put that. They have used new techniques and new concepts, and I can't explain it. It makes sense in my head, speaking as someone who does a lot of sound work himself and is a huge geek of sound design. They do so much little quiet stuff to emphasize moments and emphasize things, like a slow hum that builds up in the background and then stops. And there's like a gasp of, like a whoosh, right as it stops. And then it just sits there, and then the hum becomes this really deep bass as it's going. And all this exact example is when he is choking Krennic. Please, do me a favor, if you have the time and interest, go back, rewatch that scene, and just listen. The sound design... I have many complaints about the sequel trilogy, but the sound design is not one of them. They nail it. And they do so many things. And it is different sound design. Just listen to how ships come in and out of hyperspace is my perfect example of that. It is a legitimately different sound, but it's a different design sound. The things they do with it, to it, and from it are different as well. And I just wanted to comment on that really quick, because they've been nailing it this whole film, and this was a perfect example. So, visual proof of the Rebel problem. I already talked about this. In my notes, I was supposed to talk about this here. The snowball thing. Rebels, Syndulla, build up, Yavin 4, all that stuff. So just copy paste that here. I'm not actually going to edit that in, but I do want to mention that Bail and the Mon Calamari, Admiral Redis, are the two groups who are completely with this 100%. Everyone else is like, well, I don't believe you, or, well, there's no hope. Now, I point that out because we see once again, well, how many of you have studied war history? The big rousing speech is a nice thing in fiction, but usually it doesn't work in real life unless it's got something backing it. I could turn this into an economics equation. I could produce a currency and try to trade it with people, but it doesn't mean anything unless I'm backing it. And backing can take several different forms, either a physical species or an actual political power, or maybe I have the military might, or I'm about to claim a new territory, or whatever. There's all sorts of things that can back a currency, right? But a speech needs to be backed in the exact same way. Otherwise, it's just words. Now, she has her fire. She has been ignited, and she is trying to share that fire. But unfortunately, she has nothing behind it. Thankfully, there are members present who actually do believe in the cause sufficiently as to be willing to throw themselves into it and not give up. They have not been ground down yet. But we see in this scene everything I was talking about earlier. This is not a rebel alliance. This is a bunch of different rebel groups who happen to have a council which barely tolerates each other and can't decide anything. Doesn't even have a proper leader, if you'll notice. I also hate to point this out, but their leadership in general doesn't impress me because Draven is an idiot, as I've already described, and Mon Mothma, her big plan was evacuating Galen and putting him in front of the Senate. How well do you think that would have gone? So, yeah. So I wanted to talk about one other thing, though. There, war history. How many of you studied war history? I'm sure at least some of you have. Wars are won and fought based on, well, a lot of things. People, food, supplies, resources, money, aliens. But the point is, one of the most consistent things I see is that a big victory changes everything. I'm not going to name any specific examples, but I can think of a war right now where the side that was winning and was going to win was losing because they hadn't gotten a big victory in. And because they hadn't gotten a big victory in, they were having trouble securing foreign support, and they were having trouble curtailing the enemy's foreign support, and they were having internal disputes, and a lot of people were thinking about maybe they should just peace out and stop fighting entirely. And I remind you, this is the side that was winning by most metrics. Then they got a big victory, and then everything changed. That is what Scarif is for Star Wars and for the Rebel Alliance. This is their big victory. Now, Yavin is the really big one, legitimately. But Scarif was the first time, arguably, ever, that can be debated, obviously, where they nail a big, major victory against the Galactic Empire. And in so doing, well, now that speech has backing, doesn't it? And considering that days later, yes, days later, is the Battle of Yavin 4, well, you can see why these two victories back-to-back for the Rebels lead to the Rebel Alliance. Because now they have backing. So then Cassian gives a quieter speech, which is far more effective and works much better. We did it for the cause. If the cause is lost, then... Now, if you're paying attention, this is a form of lost, sunk cost fallacy. This is a form of that. Because they are presuming value because value has been put in. But at the same time, considering this is not an economic equation, but a personal one, it makes perfect sense. Imagine if you are capable of spending 25 years of your life working towards a singular goal. Now, let us say that you are on the verge of losing that goal, but you have a long shot to go for it. What do? Do you knuckle under and say, all right, well, that sucks, and your whole life has been a waste? Now, it's worth noting the reason why this isn't quite sunk cost fallacy is because it's important to note that that was your reason for living. That was why you kept going. That was your core, something I talk about a lot. Your central reason for bothering, as I like to put it. That was your core. Are you willing to let go of that? I mean, you can find another core, but you might not, especially if it is that important and that integral to you. If it is that core to who and what you are. And Cassian and his fellows, well, they're not willing to let go of that. And K2's coming along, because he was ordered to. So, they call themselves Rogue One, in-universe inspiration for Rogue Squadron, by the way. And this then leads to her recognizing the need to inspire the troops. And, God, I love the atoll visually. I just wanted to say that really quick. I can't decide what I think of the fact that Krennic keeps showing up wherever the party is. You notice that? It's always coincidental. It always makes sense. And it also helps keep the focus proper, because the focus stays low tier, because he is low tier. I mean, he's technically a tier up from them, but he's still a middle manager, right? So it's just, it keeps things flowing as it should. And a very minor touch happens as they're infiltrating the facility, because they see another security droid go by, who is standing very rigidly with shoulders straight up. And then it cuts to K2, and I'm sure you've noticed that K2 actually slouches a little bit. This is on purpose by Tudyk, and he was doing this as part of his presentation and his acting, his motion capture. It helps to immediately distinguish the two visually. Just wanted to comment on that really quick. Love Baze's heavy repeater again. And what we see is like the battle sequence. As usual, I don't have too much to talk about here. But we do see the benefit of off-network physical media when it comes to security. I know it's a weird thing to bring up, but it's a valid thing. Too often in fiction, everything's on a computer that can be accessed remotely. And, I mean, that's true in real life, too. But in real security cases, and this is actually true in real life, they're on closed networks, no outside connections. Or they're on a singular disk and effectively can't be pulled from that disk. You would have to physically pull the sucker out and actually carry it around. While this is arguably a throwback to the 70s, it is an intelligent modern use of the old concept because that increases security. There is a physical disk that you actually have to carry. Or I guess I could pull up a USB. I don't have a USB. And you use that, and that has the plans, or that has the information, etc., etc. You get the idea. Anyways, so then we see the AT-ACTs. Nice touch, by the way. The AT-ATs are, of course, terrifying, and there's old right. I've already talked about that. But what I like about the AT-ACT is they're still a threat, but they're a lot less of a threat than proper AT-ATs. That's part of a trend I'm going to keep talking about. There's also 3 Imperial-class Star Destroyers here, and a full flotilla of fighters defending this shield grid, and a full garrison down below, and Death Troopers. That's a lot of forces. How could the rebels do anything against that? Well, I kind of already gave this away. The brilliance of Scarif is that this was the Empire's worst. This is a bunch of troops who weren't ready, and a bunch of ship personnel who were lax, and 3 ISDs who were complemented by a bunch of, people who weren't even prepared for battle, led by someone who's an idiot. Forgive me for armchair generaling here, I guess armchair admiraling for a second, but the way that this person deploys their ISDs is legitimately stupid. Ignoring the obviousness, there's also the fact that by deploying them so close to each other, they create a weakness amongst them, which is exactly what the Admiral Radu, exploits with the Hammerhead. They do a bombing run, a full volley of ion torpedoes, which temporarily disables one of the ships. Note emphasis on the temporary. And then they use the ramming frigate, which effectively kills itself, in order to slam into the ISD, into the other ISD, into the shield generator. Now, that's a great victory. But it was won because the other side was not the best. These were people who were used to a cushy, comfortable assignment where they barely had to bother. They even let in the shuttle without even questioning it or holding it for any kind of inspection. And they sent 3 guys in when they actually do land. You see my point? This is all confirmed in outside materials. Apparently there was one group of people who actually knew what they were doing here because they run regular drills. But everyone else was just kind of doing whatever. But I bring all that up because this is why this battle is so significant. It's a big victory for the rebels. But it shouldn't have been. 3 ISDs plus a station should have crushed the rebel fleet like a bug. In the hands of a competent commander and capable crew, that would have been game. Instead, it turns into a wonderful victory for the rebels. This is also true in their general equipment. Like I said, they don't have proper hardware down below. They have AT-ACTs, the cargo transports. That's what the C stands for. So the Empire, once again, effectively handed this victory to the rebels by virtue of, the nature of how this works. After all, you can't defend everywhere equally. That is how that works. So you're always going to have your dump assignments, and the Rebel Alliance is going to have the availability of mobility. They can strike wherever. You have to defend everywhere. And, this kind of says a lot about the Galactic Empire at this point in general. While we see a little bit of this in the Rebels show, the Empire has already kind of grown lax because the Empire has been in charge for years and hasn't faced any major opposition. And yes, even this dinky, stupid little fleet that shows up in this very thing, in the final battle here, is actually much larger than anything they've faced prior to this, with a couple of notable exceptions. Hence my point. Anywho. Oh yeah, one more point, just to really emphasize the lax nature of this. It is multiple minutes before they finally launch their ties. Minutes in a combat situation. Anyways, so let's see. Yeah. Star Wars almost always has a big battle sequence in its final act. In fact, I'm not sure there's any Star Wars film that doesn't. I'd have to think about that. Even Solo kind of did. And what always happens is there's always a moment where it's the darkest before the dawn, right? It's a very common thing when they've all nearly died to the droids, and Maul is winning, and then we cut over to A New Hope, and the Death Star has wiped them all out, and all that's left is Luke and a Y-wing and an X-wing. Darkest before the dawn, that moment, right? Very common. Now, this film has the same approach. They're winning, and then they make this great victory, but then they're losing, and then things look dark. And what always happens is right after that, things turn around and they win. I'm going to go ahead and admit something. while it occurred to me at several points, and I've already admitted this, that I thought they might die when I was first watching this film, it never seriously occurred to me that they would. Because that's films, right? Films don't usually have the balls to kill off main characters, to be as blunt as I can about that. It actually aggravates the hell out of me when they not only don't kill characters off because plot shields, but then they bring them back from the dead because why not, right? Not going to make any references here. I think you can think of plenty of examples off the top of your head of times where they've done both in the same film. And so there was no tension there, because of course they're going to get out of it. They always do. Then K2 died, and I was like, and it surprised me. Now this is a bit of a meta thing, but again, film in general and Star Wars in particular, they don't do this. That's not their style, so really? So K dies. Red 5 also dies. We see the TIE Strikers. That's pretty cool. This then leads to Chirrut. Now, they do this brilliantly. Again, wonderful camera work. There's this bit where they have to get out there. The Death Troopers are covering the approach. They have a defensible position. They're kind of in a standoff. One of the rebels peeks his head out and less than a second later, shot dead. That's the Death Troopers. And again, notice how they are continuing to be the actually deadly troopers, just like the super droids I mentioned earlier. Chirrut walks out and slowly walks to the thing. It has been argued that he was borrowing so much luck, for lack of a better way to put it, that the moment he finished his task, he had to pay it all back. Zero-sum game. So he did all this and then dies immediately after accomplishing his goal. This also then leads to Bodi gets a signal through. Remember, the victor, I already talked about this, the Star Destroyer is terribly portrayed, or terribly arrayed, excuse me. Massive ion barrage, ramming, smashing. On hindsight, I actually do like how that lines up. It makes a lot of sense, and it is good tactical sense, so it's actually well designed, so credit where that goes. But then they do the insane maneuver. Bodi gets the signal out. And then a grenade is launched in. A lot of grenades in this film. Grenade gets launched in. And then Baze goes out shooting and actually manages to take out the last of the Death Troopers with him. And with Baze's death, there are only 2 left. At this moment, I'm going to go ahead and admit something. I kind of still thought there was going to be something to rescue the 2 mains. Because again, fiction. That's just how fiction does. So, this is a huge victory. I like this showcasing of why the shield goes down, by the way. This is actually really smart. And again, actually sense-making with general logic and physics. Because what happens is 2 Star Destroyers and a shield, the station, crash into it. And that's just a colossal amount of mass, which is going at a decent pace. Which means a lot of kinetic energy is very abruptly pushed into one spot on the shield, which disrupts it enough that the signal can get out. Yeah, no, that lines up. That makes perfect sense. And then the Death Star shows up, and then the reinforcement Star Destroyers show up. And this is kind of the point. This incredible victory could have turned into a defeat if they hadn't gotten the hell out of Dodge immediately. Real talk, I kept waiting for that rescue, and I was actually legitimately surprised when, Cassian and Jyn died. When the Death Star explosion encompassed them. Small little tidbit. Almost all the main characters die as part of a group. Either with their friends, or with someone on the comm, or having accomplished something. There's only 2 people in this film, with some exceptions, who really die alone. One is Saw. Yeah. And the other is Krennic. Then we have Darth Vader being freaking awesome. I could analyze this scene. I don't think I need to. Because it's just Vader enjoying himself for a minute. Just stretching, just flexing, having fun with it. I do have a couple things to talk about it. First of all, yes, this scene is incredibly awesome. It's also a good showcasing of what I like to call death walking. Death running is a different concept. That's when someone is very dangerous and deadly. But death walking is when someone is so powerful, so dangerous, and so deadly, they don't have to try to defeat you. They can casually walk through you, hence the term. And so Vader just kind of chipper shreds his way through the group, as he should. I've heard a theory that the door wasn't jammed. He was just holding it with the Force there while he was doing everything else, which would make sense. But the other thing I wanted to comment on is why I love this scene so much. And I think this is why everyone else loves this scene so much too. It's not because it's awesome. I mean, that is relevant. It is awesome. And it is very well choreographed. And it is basically a horror movie moment where the horror monster is just smashing through everything. But the reason I think we all love this scene so much is another thing that it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. With the advances in technology and time and tools and personnel and budget that we have now, we can show things we couldn't before. We just straight up could not. And while there's some good stuff, legitimately good stuff in old things, and I don't want to dismiss that, I actually still to this day hold the lightsaber battle in Empire Strikes Back as one of my personal favorite lightsaber battles of all time, despite the limitations of it. But nevertheless, the ability to visually show something like this and audibly show something like this is a relatively new thing within the last, I'd say, decade or so. This was the first time we'd seen Vader unleash. We'd heard about it in the books. Shadows of the Empire talks about how much of a death machine Vader was. Many, many, many works and games have gotten across the idea that Vader is just this absolute juggernaut. But how many times had we seen it? Well, now we have. And on the big screen, with the full budget. And thus, just like the destruction of Jedha, even though this is just one random thing where he just kills a bunch of no-named mooks, it feels more because they are able to present it better. I'm going to go ahead and admit something, and I admitted this last time I watched this film too. I wanted to immediately go watch A New Hope after this. I don't have time. I have other movies to cover. But as soon as I finished this, I wanted to just switch immediately to the Blu-ray of A New Hope and just start watching that. Or maybe the special edition. Or maybe the original. I'm sorry, I've probably talked way too long. I have no idea how long this video is. I'm not even going to look. I do hope you've enjoyed all my thoughts, as ever and as always. And I will see you... Wrong one. And I will see you next time.